Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Batra. We are up to Perek Vav Mishna Aleph. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'elui Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Ranbai Veliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Chana ben Miriam Sason ben Raya and Yoshua ben Shifra Menuchatam began Eden Amen and Avdi ben Chaim Lechaim v'derefua shenemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa betoch Shach Olei Yisrael and Achlama Merav ben Amin Od Zion Chai ben Dvorah. The first three Mishnayot of this chapter teach rules that apply when one sells an item and it is later found to be defective or spoiled. If someone sells produce to his fellow without discussing whether the produce is being sold for food to be eaten or for planting seed, so the produce was a type that can either be eaten as is or planted, such as kernels or grains, kernels of grain or beans. Velot simchu, and the buyer planted the produce but it did not sprout. Vafilu zera pishtan, even if the produce being sold was flax seeds, which are usually bought for planting. And no chayav b'chayutan, the seller is not responsible to pay for the produce because he can claim that he sold it to be used as food, not to be planted. Now, even though the produce was defective as it did not grow, since the buyer did not state at the time of the sale that he was buying the produce to plant it, he cannot demand a refund. Now, although the rule is that in cases of doubt we follow the majority rov, this will apply to laws that involve prohibitions. For example, when we find a piece of cake in the street and are unsure if it came from a kosher bakery or a non-kosher one, the cake is permitted if the majority of bakeries in the town are kosher. But with regard to monetary law, the rule is that we do not follow the majority to remove money from someone's possession, what we call en olchin b'mamon ha'arov. Therefore, although the majority of flax is purchased for planting, the seller can still claim that these particular flax seeds were sold for food, and the buyer cannot demand a refund. Now, the Mishnah's first ruling implies that if the produce sold was a type that can only be used for planting, the seller would have to issue a refund if the planted produce did not grow. The Mishnah's next ruling states this explicitly. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, if he sold the buyer garden seeds that are not edible, such as cabbage or leek seeds or wildflower seeds, and they did not sprout when they were planted, then he is responsible to pay for them, because it is obvious that they were bought for planting and the sale is therefore void. Since the seeds were clearly purchased for planting, if they do not sprout, the sale is a mistaken sale, and the seller must refund the buyer's money. Now, this law applies where it is clear that the reason the seeds did not sprout is because they were defective and not because the buyer planted them improperly or there was a drought or the like. Now, the Gemara explains that there is no dispute in our Mishnah. Rather, the entire Mishnah follows the view of a single Tana, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. In the first case, the buyer is not entitled to a refund because the seller can claim the sale was made for food, but where no such claim is possible, he is entitled to a refund. And that is in of Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Bet discusses what percentage of impurities or inferior items a buyer must accept when buying various items. If someone sells produce such as grain or beans to his fellow, the buyer must accept up to a quarter kav of impurities such as straw or pebbles for each seah of produce that he buys. After wheat or other grain is harvested, it is threshed to break the straw and chaff from the kernels and then winnowed so the wind will carry away the waste. It is common for a certain amount of waste, either straw or pebbles that became mixed with the grain as it was threshed, to remain. And when crops such as lentils are dug from the ground, it's common for a certain amount of earth to cling to them. One who buys such produce must expect to find and pay for this waste as it is part of a normal sale, just as one who buys a watermelon by weight pays even for the edible seeds and rind. A se'ah equals 6 kav, so a buyer of produce must accept that up to 1/24 of his purchase will be waste material rather than produce, for it is common to find this much waste matter in grain or beans that have been harvested. However, if more waste than this is found, then the buyer is not required to pay for any of it, because finding such an amount is unusual, and we penalize the seller because we suspect that he may have mixed it in deliberately, which is equal to theft. Te'anim, similarly, if someone is buying figs, he must accept up to 10 wormy figs for each 100 that he buys, for it is common for 1 in 10 figs to have worms. Although the Mishnah speaks of a large sale of 100 figs, the percentage holds true for a smaller sale as well. The buyer of 10 figs must accept 1 fig that is wormy. The Mishnah now turns to one who sells barrels of wine. Maltef shel yain, if one sells the contents of a cellar of wine to his fellow, mikabel alav 10 kosisot lemea, The buyer must accept up to 10 barrels of inferior wine, meaning wine that has begun to sour but is not yet sour enough to be considered spoiled. For each 100 barrels that he buys, it was common for up to a tenth of one's wine to turn sour in this way, so the buyer must accept this amount of souring wine. Now, the final case of the Mishnah deals with the purchase of empty wine barrels, kankanim basharon. If one sells earthenware barrels to his fellow in the Sharon Valley region of Eretz Israel, mekabel alav 10 pitasyaot lemea, the buyer must accept up to 10 inferior barrels for each 100 that he buys. The clay in the Sharon Valley was of poor quality, and some of the barrels that were produced there would leak or crack. So someone who buys barrels there must expect that up to 10% of the barrels he buys will be imperfect. Now, the buyer is not required to accept barrels that are actually leaking or cracked, and this ruling applies only in the Sharon Valley. One who buys barrels anywhere else where the clay is not inferior need not accept any inferior barrels. And that is the Nabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.